Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Douglas Johnson. I am a certified yoga teacher at the advanced 500 hour level. I am a ordained minister, a kirtan artist, amongst other things. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about science or innovation versus tradition. And I believe I've done a talk about this before, but I thought it'd be nice to revisit this and just share my thoughts in a new video. Before I do get into the talk, I do want to thank the community that makes this possible. I teach classes, I lead retreats, I do different things, but my online offerings are supported by a small community of regular contributors on Patreon. And I don't have, there are different price levels you can join at, but you get everything, even if you join for free or you don't even join, you have access to all the content on there. And this is my way of trying to have a modern version of the tradition where spiritual teaching was done by tithing. It's done by people who feel called to contribute and to help support a teacher or tradition or teaching. And so that's not possible with my yoga classes. It's not possible with my retreats because of the other parties involved. But it is possible with my online offerings. But I did want to highlight that it's only because of this community of regular support that I actually have the time and resources to do this. So this might look like this is just me getting up here and offering these talks for free, but actually this is the end result of people like you contributing on a regular basis to make this possible. So I want to thank that community. Also, some people make one-time or infrequent donations when they feel called to by a certain video. I want to thank those people as well. And if you'd like to contribute or become a part of that, you can check out the links below. And again, you can join for free. So if you're just curious or you're interested in what kind of content I'm putting on Patreon that I can't put on YouTube, then you can check that out. I also want to thank everyone on YouTube who likes, subscribes, shares, comments. Those things do help out for sure. Okay, so science versus tradition, or maybe you can think of innovation versus tradition. As I said, I think I did a talk about this many years ago. I don't really remember what I said, but you can probably scroll back and find that. Might have a similar title. But this has been on my mind lately, so I thought I would share. So from my perspective and my experience, the way I see it is there are advantages and disadvantages to each. If you grew up in the modern West or a part of the world that has been greatly influenced by the modern West, so there are parts of Asia or Africa or other parts of the world that are essentially the modern West. So let's not get into geographics. This is really about mindset. But that's where I grew up. I grew up in Manhattan, in New York City, and I grew up very much with this almost religious-like belief in modern science, that modern science had the answer to everything, that whatever the answer that modern science gave, that was the final answer. That was the word. You can't argue with that. Now, I've since learned that that is incorrect. Science is subject to fashion. It's subject to peer pressure. It's subject to bias, right? Which studies get funded, which ones don't. These are all things that are managed by people. Okay, it's not like if I have a scientific idea that I automatically get funding for that idea and that all ideas are treated equally. No, certain ideas, certain theories, certain concepts will gain in fashion in a scientific community or go out of fashion. And if you're in fashion, then you get a lot of funding, even if in the end your idea is proven to be not actually tenable or accurate. Even if in the end the tests prove that you were incorrect in your theory or assumption. So this has to be understood. I think many people don't really understand the scientific process. And another thing about the scientific process is any study that's done is meant to be replicated by other people, other groups. And what you find is, and again, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know this firsthand, but this is what I've learned by listening to others, is that what tends to happen in modern science is there's not a lot of money or fame or recognition in replicating someone else's study. So you might read a headline that XYZ lowers blood pressure. University, this university showed a study where XYZ lowers blood pressure. Okay, that's nice, but according to the scientific method, that is supposed to be replicated by a third party, not the same group doing the same experiment, but by somebody else, someplace else in a different lab. And again, it's my understanding that this doesn't happen very often in modern science. Again, because scientists, like the rest of us, they need to eat. They need funding. They need to build a name for themselves. And if I'm spending a lot of time replicating someone else's study, I'm not developing my own study. I'm not publishing my own paper. I'm possibly just showing that some other study wasn't run very well, or that I wasn't able to replicate the results. Okay, so again, I can't verify this for myself. I am a yoga teacher, all right? But again, this is what I have heard is happening. So my point in all of this is, if you grew up in the West like I did, at least in the time that I did, you may have had an almost religious-like faith in science, the scientific method, and scientists. If a scientist or a study came out or something was published and it said XYZ, you just believed it. That was it, the end of the line. No, nothing else was to be said. This is science. You saw this somewhat during the pandemic, where people would sort of push a certain viewpoint and say, follow the science, or that's the science, or whatnot. While I'm a huge fan of science and the scientific method, and I do want to be as scientific as possible, it's a little less clear than that. Again, if I just say, well, that's the science, it sounds so final, and it sounds like that's completely reliable. But if you've been alive as long as I have, then you've seen where in your lifetime, certain statements that were made that were said to be scientific, later on, you find the scientific community or the medical community retracting these statements and saying, well, maybe that's actually not true. And so when you see that, it begins to erode your faith in science. You begin to say, well, okay, if today they're saying XYZ isn't actually true, and they were saying it's true before, they were saying that that was scientific fact, and now they're saying it's not, what's next? what else can happen, okay? So again, I want to be very clear here. I am not against science, the scientific method. I would encourage everyone to be as scientific as possible, but we also need to recognize the limits of science and where human, again, fashion, human peer pressure, human bias can get involved in scientific research and the scientific method and begin to muddy the waters, not to mention money, bribery, falsification of results, all kinds of other things can happen. So the scientific method, if it were followed perfectly, if money were not an object, if we could isolate the people doing the science from current fashion, fad, bias, then maybe it would produce perfect results. But that's not reality. So we always have to be pragmatic about reality. Science does not exist in a vacuum with perfect human beings running the experiments. That's just not the way that it is. Let's face facts, okay? So scientists are human beings. Human beings are flawed. Human beings have weaknesses. Human beings have biases. Human beings need to eat and to clothe and feed and shelter their children. They need to get paid. So all of this introduces a weakness into the system. Again, if we could somehow shelter scientists from all of this, then maybe we would have a perfect system. So I like what one of my teachers said about science. And this is Paul Grilly, who, as many of you know, has had a very large influence on me as a teacher. And he said, we have to be as scientific as possible in our approach to yoga, but we can't wait for science. And I love this statement because what he was saying is, let's not get emotional about things. Let's not fly off the handle. Let's not believe every statement that someone makes about the chakras or the Sushumna or subtle energy or karma. Let's be skeptical. Let's look at our sources. Let's test things out for ourselves. But why did he say we can't wait for science? Well, one of the flaws, if you will, with scientific research that is very rigorous, okay, is that it requires a lot of money. Requires a lot of money, requires some time as well, resources. And the only people that really have that kind of money are large institutions. So think of like a very large university, governments, right, nation states, and generally like pharmaceutical companies. And the way things currently stand, none of these groups really have that much interest in proving the effectiveness of yogic techniques. I am aware of some research that's been done at the university level. My understanding, though, is that these tend to be clinical and smaller. They aren't the large-scale studies that get the big headlines. So generally, those results are taken with more skepticism. And again, very often, you'll see in the findings, more research is necessary, more research is necessary. So you don't get this very kind of strong scientific voice saying, yes, pranayams work for this and that and the other thing. I've actually met scientists who were studying breath work in person. I've done workshops with them. So they're out there. But again, I don't hear their names being bandied about on the New York Times, the cover of the New York Times, or even on YouTube. These are people that I just happen to cross paths with. And for me, they're doing fascinating work. But if I didn't happen to cross paths with them, I would not even know their name or have heard of them, okay? So we need to be as scientific as possible. You don't want to throw away a scientific approach or the scientific method or scientific results. But we can't wait because the funding isn't there. And in my lifetime, the situation as it is here in the country I live in is probably not likely to change. All the money, again, the government, it's not going to pay for these large studies to show the effectiveness of yoga and the techniques that we use. So we are in a situation where, yes, let's be scientific. Let's take the research that's been done. Let's run with it. But we also can't put all of our stock into scientific research. Okay, and this is where some people want to take yoga, and that's fine. Anyone can do whatever they want. I'm not here to tell anyone what they should do. I'm just sharing my thought process. So my feeling is science brings a lot of value. If we can get something both verified by science and tradition, then that probably means we're on a very good track, okay? But as I said, there are a lot of techniques and there's a lot of teaching that isn't verified scientifically. So some people, again, they want to say, oh, let's only do evidence-based yoga. Let's only use evidence-based techniques. Well, you're going to throw a lot out. You're going to throw a lot out. And in general, a lot of the things that we were told were good for us from the yogic tradition, when they are studied using the scientific method, they actually prove to be useful, okay? So we do want to be careful, I think, or hesitant about just taking things and throwing them in the garbage, right? Because, that's not verified by science, so we're not going to do that. You end up with a very limited set of tools, and perhaps some of the most powerful tools for connecting with spirit, breaking through the kind of haze of the ego are taken off the table, okay? So another teacher I studied with, he said something else which is interesting about tradition, okay? So tradition is the kind of the other side of it. With science, we get a kind of rigorous testing, but it tends to happen over a relatively short amount of time. I'm not aware of, there might be, but I'm not really aware of a study, or there might be one, but most studies don't span lifetimes, generations. We test something for days, weeks, months, maybe years. If we're lucky, maybe decades, maybe a lifetime, but very few things have been tested for generations, okay? So maybe I do something and it benefits me in the short term, but maybe it actually has a negative effect for my offspring, right? We're learning about epigenetics and how things and choices I make today can actually be passed down to my offspring through epigenetics. So, as far as I know, science really can't claim to be able to say, oh, we know that this is safe for generations. I don't even think that was on science's radar until very recently. However, as far as I'm aware of, I've heard different practitioners of Chinese medicine and holistic medicine speak about generations and how the effects of doing something can have an effect generations from now. And so one practitioner who was a fertility doctor, who was a classically trained Taoist doctor, and he was saying how, you know, even if he could get you pregnant, which is what you want and what he wants, right? That's what he's getting paid for. Even if he knew a certain way to make that happen, he might not use that because of the downstream effect that it would have on the child that was born. Every action has a reaction. And so if my system, for whatever reason, is not able to produce what's necessary to produce a new human life, then perhaps that's saying something on a fundamental level, that maybe I need to address my health. Maybe I need to address other aspects of the reproductive process. And then if I do that, then naturally I'll be able to have healthy offspring. However, if I use a trick, I use some concoction, something like that, to just kind of trick my biology into producing an offspring, then perhaps that offspring will not be healthy. And then that could be passed down for generations. We see this with mice. And so again, this isn't simply Taoist thought. We see this with mice where they will disrupt their gut microbiome in one generation, and then they can see the after effects for generations of mice after that, that they are affected by this disruption in the gut microbiome. Okay, so we are, I think, in the scientific community beginning to become aware of this bigger picture, but how do we test for that, right? How do we see the long-term effects of taking a drug, medication, or having a surgery generations down the line? I think with science, we're just not there yet. We don't have the curiosity, we don't have the funding, we don't have what's necessary. However, when you plug into tradition, this is one of the upsides of tradition, is at least some of the practices that are part of a tradition have been around for a very, very long time. They have been observed generation after generation after generation. And some thought, as alluded to by this doctor's comments, who was again a fertility doctor trained in Taoist medicine, there's been thought about this. This is a tradition that has thought about, okay, if we do this or that, it's going to have this downstream effect on the offspring, which will then ripple, right? Because those offspring will want to have offspring, and they will want to have offspring. Okay, so if I can address the root issue of the problem and make the individual healthy enough to have a healthy offspring, this is the real solution, not some trick, not some fertility trick. And I'm sorry to say, but my own sense of where we are with modern science and medicine is most of what we're seeing in the fertility in modern science medicine is going to be some kind of a trick, some kind of a drug or some kind of process. They aren't necessarily going to address the health of the couple or other factors that might be at play, right? Whether the couple is a good match for actually having offspring or not. Anyway, this gets well beyond the scope of this talk. So another teacher I studied with, Yoganand Michael Carroll, I remember I had a conversation with him, and he once said that everything in the Zen tradition, because he knew I was a Zen practitioner, he said everything in the Zen tradition is there for a reason. But he said some of the reasons have changed. And I'll explain what he meant by that. Is perhaps there was a certain ritual that was done in Zen because there were bandits. And so perhaps they adjusted their practices because if they didn't do this or that, bandits would come raiding the Zendo. So maybe they were quiet. Maybe they locked the door. Maybe they had a certain way of walking so not to draw attention to themselves. This is just a hypothetical example. This is not a real, this isn't based on anything that I'm aware of in history. So what can happen with tradition is something gets adopted for a reason at one point in time, but unless practitioners understand the reason for each element of what they're doing, then they can simply blindly follow tradition, and sometimes that can actually cause a lot of harm. So I'll give you an example from an experiment that was done with monkeys. And this is a very interesting experiment in my mind, and I've shared this before. But they did an experiment where they put monkeys in an electrified cage. So this cage could be, an electric shock could be sent through the cage and the monkeys would receive this shock. It wasn't dangerous, it wasn't going to kill them, but it was unpleasant. Then what they did is they strung up some bananas from the roof and they put a ladder to the bananas. And of course, monkeys love bananas. So they would leave them in there. One of the monkeys would climb the ladder. And when they did that, what they would do is they'd shock everyone on the ground. Now, monkeys aren't stupid, so they pretty quickly figured out, okay, every time someone's on that ladder, we're getting a shock. So what they started doing was anytime one of them tried to go for the bananas, they would jump on them and beat them up. So eventually you had a cage full of monkeys where there were bananas, ripe bananas, ready for eating, hanging, a ladder to get to them, but no one was touching them, right? They all knew that they would get a shock. Then what they started doing is switching out one monkey at a time. So they put a new monkey in. The new monkey, of course, had never been shocked and had never been beaten up trying to get the bananas. So they come in, there's some ripe bananas hanging, and they think, wow, I don't know why these guys aren't getting the bananas, but I'm going for it. So they get on the ladder, they've been climbing, all the monkeys jump on them, beat them up. Now, this monkey never gets to experience a shock. They just get beat up, okay? They just know that if I go for these bananas, everyone else jumps on me and beats the hell out of me. They keep switching out the old monkeys who had gotten the shock for the new monkeys who had never been shocked. Okay, they'd only been beaten up when getting on the ladder. And eventually they had all the monkeys switched out, and yet the behavior persisted. Every time one of the monkeys got on the ladder and tried to climb up, everyone would jump on them and beat them up. So there was a culture that was created. Now this was with monkeys, okay? And monkeys are social animals like us, but if anything, we're even more social. We have more rules and ideas about right and wrong and good and bad and all of these sorts of things. So my point in sharing this example with you is that this happens to us, no question about it. And if you plug into a tradition, be it the yoga tradition, again, there isn't one yoga tradition. There are different lineages with different practices and different ideas. There are certain statements that may be universal across yogic schools, but they might be actually few and far between. And what you might find is a statement that's made in that way, different groups may have different interpretations. I believe this is true of Christianity and any other tradition, to be honest, that different groups of Christians and even each individual Christian may have a different way of interpreting a certain line from Scripture or a certain idea. So, what you get when you have a tradition is you inherit this sort of mixed bag. You're probably getting some very powerful things, some very powerful practices. perhaps some very powerful ideas to help you live a happy and fulfilled human existence. But like Yoganand, Michael Carroll, said, everything in Zen is there for a reason, but some of the reasons have changed. Perhaps if we could freeze the yoga tradition at a certain point in time, then maybe everything taught in the tradition would have been accurate and would have been helpful and useful for the individual. Maybe. I'm not even going to go that far and say for sure, but let's just say that perhaps if we froze things in time at a certain time and place, then a certain teaching could be perfectly relevant. However, that's not what we're getting, is it, when we get a tradition? Are we living in the ancient Vedic or Brahmanic culture? Pre-computers, pre-technology, pre-internet, pre-social media, pre-industrialized food? Are we? Because if we aren't, then it's at least possible that some of the things that were relevant and effective and made sense for an individual growing up in pre-industrial Vedic or Brahmanic culture, you know, the lands of Pakistan, India, Nepal, those regions, perhaps it would have fit like a glove. If they just followed tradition to a T, it fit like a glove and everything just made sense. Same with, say, Christianity. Perhaps there was a time when if we just followed the Christian teaching really closely, it would have made perfect sense. There wouldn't have to been a lot of interpretation or trying to figure out what people meant. It would have just made sense. But I don't think we live in that day and age anymore. Every day that goes by, we get further from when the scriptures and these traditions were written and the people and communities they were talking to. So I like to say that tradition always comes with a temporal and geographical tint or color. Where it was written or received, the community that it was shared with, the time in which it was shared, these all color scripture and tradition. Now, if you have good, enlightened teachers, they can take tradition and make it alive. They will have a good sense of what is relevant and what is not. And they can either reinterpret things that are no longer relevant or perhaps even discard with things. However, you need to be very careful that the person doing this is enlightened, is spiritually awake, is in touch with spirit. Because otherwise it's very easy for the ego to come in and start trying to change things to its benefit. A lot of change is made in service of ego when it comes to spirituality. So I don't think it's a secret to anyone who's been privy to my teaching for a while. Things that are called yoga or spirituality can be used in service of the ego and often are. So it's not like just because I call myself a yoga teacher that necessarily means I'm serving spirit, or just because I call myself a preacher, or just because I call myself anything, okay? Likewise, there can be people who don't even mention the word spirit or God or religion or yoga, and yet they might be teaching from a very deep spiritual place, and they may not even see it in that way. They might just be seeing what they're sharing as truth or love or kindness or compassion, And for them, it's not coming from any kind of conception that they would call spirit or God or anything like that. So we need to be careful. Just because someone calls something spiritual or yogic or something like that doesn't necessarily mean it's actually serving spirit. It could be serving ego. So we have science, it has its pitfalls. We have tradition, it has its pitfalls. Each also has its strengths. Again, with science, we have a rather rigorous way of trying to discern truth from human sort of bias. And then with tradition, we have a very long, although perhaps mostly anecdotal, way of testing. But in some ways, time can be more rigorous than, again, a short study, right? Certain things might take time to figure out if they are actually effective or how they affect us. So there's one other thing I'd like to touch on before I wrap up the talk today, and that's placebo. So again, as we have begun to study these traditions and the teachings of the yogic or Taoist or Buddhist tradition, we're finding very powerful techniques, very powerful practices to transform our lives for the better, to make us happier, to make us healthier, to put us in touch with what I call spirit. If you don't like that word, use any word you want. You can call it joy, you can call it peace, you can call it love. For me, those are basically the same thing. I call it spirit, most often anyway. So getting in touch with these things, feeling love in our lives, feeling that we have love to give, that others, we are supported in love, supported by the universe, that the universe isn't against us, that God isn't against us. This can be very important for how productive we are as human beings, how happy we are, how we influence others. So these are things that we have been very quick to throw out, saying religion, and I speak from my own personal experience, everybody, okay? When I was younger, I was only too happy to throw out religion and spirituality, say we need to get rid of this. And that's because of the bad part of tradition, okay? So again, if we have a bunch of monkeys who are beating up others because of something that happened a long time ago that isn't relevant anymore, then we have a problem. But it can be very difficult. Again, we need to be careful. It can be very difficult to determine what is truly essential teaching and what isn't. And this is why, again, I think a teacher needs to have quite a bit of spiritual insight to be able to navigate this effectively, because otherwise I think you very easily can lead people astray and you can allow your own ego to call the shots. So the last thing I want to talk about is placebo. Now, usually when it comes to science, placebo is seen as a bad thing. If you've ever read Dr. Joe Dispenza's book, You Are the Placebo, he is suggesting another way of looking at placebo that I actually am a big fan of, which is, I don't know if you know this, but they've done research on placebo and they've shown that some placebos are more powerful than others. So it's easy to look back at tradition and maybe you hear about a faith healing. Maybe you hear about someone who prayed and then they were cured. Maybe you hear about someone who was sprinkled with water from a certain holy place and they were cured of a disease. And you think, well, that's just placebo. That was just in their mind. I don't really care, to be honest with you. Science is, I think science would be well served to actually study placebo more and figure out what can we do that creates effective placebo. because I think Dr. Joe and myself, given the background we've had with spirituality, we know the power of the mind, okay? And if I can effectively suggest something to my mind, then that is a powerful tool. So, how was this done in the past? Well, it might have been done with something like a rain dance. That would have involved dancing and some kind of music, probably some chanting as well, using certain words. Definitely in the yoga tradition, we have the tradition of mantra, right? Saying a certain combination of sounds or words in perhaps a repetitive or rhythmic way, sometimes with song, like in kirtan, or sometimes just very repetitive, monotone, like with japamala. Okay? Again, if I believe it, if my mind accepts that, then that can be a powerful tool for healing, for change, for growth. It doesn't matter if it is actually scientifically provable, okay? It doesn't matter if there's some kind of chemical or mechanical thing happening. If the mind accepts it and believes it, and the mind is powerful enough to control the body, then that's all we need to know. So some things, if we look back in tradition and we study them scientifically, again, what we'll find is, oh, these things were effective versus placebo. However, some things we may one day find, well, this was actually a placebo. However, perhaps it's a very powerful placebo. And perhaps that's all that really matters, is that the mind accepts it. Many of you know I've been very interested and curious about manifestation. And this is the big thing that is said in the manifestation community, that if the mind will accept and believe a concept as true, then it will manifest in what we call physical reality. But that's the second part of it. Most of us want to reverse that and say seeing is believing. When I see it, I'll believe it. But what the manifestation community is saying, no, you need to believe it first, and then you will see it. And so this brings us back to concepts like faith. So again, if I grew up in a culture where eating a certain food or doing a certain dance or saying a certain phrase or singing a certain song or doing a certain prayer, if I believe strong enough that that is enough to transform reality, then according to the manifestation community, that is enough. That is enough. And the only breakdown comes from a lack of faith or belief, right? The person didn't actually believe it. And this is part of what happened with science coming in, is perhaps before pre-science, we had a lot of placebo, but placebos that worked. Things that could suggest to the human mind, which is probably one of the most powerful things in the universe, or at least that we are aware of. So we had methods of suggesting to the human mind that things were going to change. The mind accepted it, and things changed. Then when we started believing that the only two ways to cure or to heal were through chemicals, drugs, or mechanical surgery, then we started disbelieving everything else. Oh, chanting doesn't work. Prayer doesn't work. Dancing doesn't work. Drinking holy water doesn't work. Nothing works but drugs and surgery. I don't really want to get into why that happened, but very briefly, drugs and surgery are ways that you can charge to heal. There's a lot of other methods for healing that go way, way, way back that are probably effective, but Why are we not going to study them? Why are we not going to prove that they work? Again, because no one's going to get rich off of that. And the person who's going to fund that study is probably someone who's hoping to get rich. So if you're a philanthropist and you want to spend your money and you're looking for places to go, this is a good place. Look at these traditions and study these methodologies and see which ones are more or less effective and share that with the world. Create a medicine chest, if you will, a library of things that are cheap or free or easy to do to keep the human animal happy and healthy throughout her lifetime. And you will be giving a true gift to the world. I'm sure you can find people interested in doing this research, especially in this day and age. But again, what you're going to find is not many people are willing to fund them. All right, everybody, I hope this was helpful. If there are any questions, please reach out as always. If I can be of help, please reach out. Please like, comment, subscribe if you're on YouTube. That does help. And again, if you'd like to help support these talks and what I do online with a little financial support, some tithing, if you will, then please check out the links below. Check out the Patreon page. If you're in the Atlanta area, please come take a class. I'd love to see you in person, even if it's infrequently. Until next time, namaste, and have a beautiful, beautiful day.